Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Tracey Parnell, a medical doctor providing frontline medical care in Ukraine. She's treated both combat-related wounds and provided primary care for those in battle zones, alternating with immigration and refugee work. In her native Canada, she delivers primary care as part of the BC Rural Locum Program, provides coverage to rural communities. Tracey, thank you for coming on to the channel. You might have to give a It's absolutely brilliant. You may want to give a slightly longer introduction, especially around your work in Ukraine. I mean, let's start with that. How did you get into it? Why Ukraine? How long have you been doing it? And what are the kind of things you've been doing there?
Right. So like most of the world, I really didn't pay all that much attention to Ukraine until early February when folks started to say this is going to happen. And I reached out to people I know and, was starting to get increasingly concerned. And in April, I watched with horror on February 22nd. I mean, it felt like you were watching a bad war movie. And in April, I had a colleague that I had done some work with who was talking about her husband's experience, and they were trying to figure out how to help gynecologists learn how to put in chest tubes. And I've spent a lifetime doing trauma training with a military background as well. And I said, well, I'll put some stuff together and I'll come over, and packaged up, bought a bunch of supplies and made my first trip over. I was supposed to be there a week. And by the time I had made it to Lviv, where she was situated, I had been connected with a whole pile of different NGOs and groups on the Eastern Front. That's where I ended up, and my return kept getting postponed and postponed. And I quickly and sadly realized the horror of what I was actually seeing. Part of me still is in a bit of shock that it's real. Like when you're there, part of you is like, is it a movie set? Like, this is just so surreal. But it's sadly very real. The deaths are very real. The injuries are horrific and awful and real. And I think for me, sort of the turning point, why I keep going back, this will be my 6th trip coming up, is the Ukrainian people are very similar to Canada. In fact, a lot of immigrants from Ukraine have come to Canada over the years because there's such a geographic similarity and sort of a personality similarity in many ways. So I had an affinity for them. And when I first went, I was kind of neutral, I admit. I was like, this is kind of something that's gone off and on for forever. And I'm not really taking sides. It's about land. And I was really surprised when everyone, like not just a couple of people, but everyone I spoke to had the same narrative, had the same passion. We are fighting for freedom. We are fighting for the freedom you already have and take for granted. And individuals, I'm prepared to die to make sure that my children and grandchildren have freedom. And I remember my older relatives sharing their experiences of world wars and saying that line, freedom isn't free, and we fought for your freedom. We fought for freedom. And really, even with a military service background, it didn't really mean anything to me. Like it didn't click until I was there. And then I'm like, I get what this is. And this is the most significant existential battle that's currently going on that has the potential. I mean, every war is horrible, but the potential for this to evolve and impact the entire globe is, disproportionate to anything that we've seen since World War II.
Well, we'll
So,
talk about the scale. I mean,
yeah,
the scale of it,
yeah,
because with your training, and I don't know if you've been in other war zones as well. The scale of what's happening in Ukraine, I think, is only just dawning on people.
right,
Even someone like me who's interviewed now many dozens of Ukrainians, I'm only
yeah,
really starting to get a sense of the vast scale of trauma, horror, and
right,
suffering that's been inflicted.
right, right. You're right. The scale is unbelievable. And I use an example when I'm speaking to medical personnel in particular. So in the United States, to qualify as sort of the top tier trauma center, you have to meet a bunch of criteria. And one is, of course, volume related. And I mean, there's a few different criteria that are published, but for the most part, you have to have about 240 seriously injured. So there's a scoring system, and you have to have 240 or more of these patients in a year. And in places like Bakhmut and some other places on the Eastern Front, that volume of patients, you can sometimes achieve between 100 and 220 every 24 hours. I mean, that's unimaginable. I mean, I've been there, and it's still unimaginable for me to sort of share that scale.
And that's just one centre, right? There will be other centres around the
Yeah,
country, and there'll be
absolutely,
centres around the front lines.
absolutely, all around the. I mean, it's multiplied by numerous fold along the Eastern Front. And again, I'm more familiar with the Eastern Front than the Southern, but I mean, it's probably the same there, I imagine. But it's just unbelievable. And then the number of people that we see that survive but have life-altering wounds. I've never seen so many limbs blown off, so many eye and head injuries. I think we were looking at different statistics, and 16% of the injuries involved losing sight. My numbers, I think, were almost 20% of the people I was seeing are probably going to be blind or have serious vision issues. What does that do? Minus surviving right now, which is really, really important. What does that do for a country for the future when a huge portion of your population will suffer from some disability? Yeah, unimaginable.
And that's before you even consider the psychological trauma. I was going to come to that later, but
Yeah,
we should touch on that, because here you've not just got service personnel, you've also got civilians, children on a vast
absolutely.
scale who will be
Yeah,
psychologically traumatized.
yeah. I do some primary care clinics when I'm there, but through telehealth media. When we're back in Canada, there's a whole team of people helping. And the psychological impact, most of the people who are still, this is changing a little bit. I should put a caveat in that, a lot of the people who are still in the East, they're elderly, they're vulnerable, they have, addictions, problems, other health issues. Going is not that easy. The caveat being that a lot of people, tried to leave, couldn't find jobs, couldn't find work, couldn't find housing. Now they're back, and so that's the younger population sort of returning, and they have absolutely ridiculous health needs, as well as the psychological concern about constant shelling and bombarding. And we know that PTSD and the sort of psychological trauma that is being that is happening here has lifelong consequences. So yeah, a whole country, and that's of course if victory can be achieved and soon. And there's a lot that has to go into accomplishing that still.
That question that you raised a minute ago, which I think is fascinating, this idea of freedom and the idea that it needs to be fought for. And people are willing to contemplate, an element of suffering and deprivation of their own interests in order
Absolutely.
to pursue that. It comes on different scales, doesn't it? I mean, the most immediate is the freedom to survive, essentially. And
Right.
there are definite genocidal characteristics of the Russian invasion, but it also exists on subtler levels, doesn't it? Language, identity, culture, the freedom to
Absolutely.
express yourself, or even freedom to explore that national character, which is
Absolutely.
evolving in the
Right.
post-Soviet period. What was your impression in these trips to Ukraine of that? The evolving Ukrainian identity as
Right.
a thing to fight for.
Right. Well, again, when I looked a little bit at history, and I had shared with you earlier that, I had been asked for this sort of for a conference, and I was surprised to see that this battle has actually, the Ukrainian identity has sort of been a struggle since about the 900s. So this is something that's been ongoing. It's interesting you bring up language and such, because I think there is this concept that, well, if you speak Russian, then you are Russian. And I shared, my experience in Canada. It's like, well, a portion of our population speaks French, but they wouldn't identify themselves as French, as in from the country of France. They have their own unique identity that is integrated within the Canadian, multicultural environment. How is that different for people in Ukraine? Can you not have other languages and other cultural components without having to be subsumed into this larger mass of forced cultural identity? And I really think the rest of the world is really has worked towards allowing self-determination culturally, and embracing and honoring and celebrating that. And I think that has not happened with our Far East friends. And that's problematic, because there's a very different vision of what it means to have a cultural identity. And as you say, the Ukrainians have been fighting for that for a long, long time, from the Holodomor and all of these events of cultural oppression, and they're willing to die for it. I don't know if we would be in the same, passion, because it's so easy for us. We couldn't imagine someone actually fighting hard enough to take away our cultural identity, we would think it would be threatened. But it's made me aware that what we have is pretty special, and we should be willing to sacrifice for it and to protect it.
That's right. I mean, it's I've heard people say that, well, as someone who lives in England, there are cultural battles, linguistic battles going on in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and there are tensions there. But we're talking something, I'd say, far more pernicious here. We're talking about a country, Russia, with an imperial mindset of the 18th and 19th century, which is absolutely not averse to expunging all other identities and erasing them and punishing anyone who dares to try and express that identity. What did you experience of that, or what did people tell you about their experiences of that?
Well, when I was fortunate enough to meet people who had been in the East, and who had lived under Russian influence or Russian occupation, they were so adamant that, and I had people who were like, we kind of didn't think it'd be a big deal. We've been under rule of Big Brother Russia before, but this is a whole nother level. And even though we may identify as ethnic Russians, or Russia is our native language, we no longer identify with the imperial approach. And I think that was really key, what you said, Robin, was this, all of us have an imperial past culturally. Maybe Canada, not quite as much, but yeah, we have imperial roots, but they're a couple of hundred years behind, and we're still living with consequences in many ways. But we recognize that that's not the best way to build a global world. That is not the mindset of what we see being expressed in this war. And the Russian government is certainly demonstrating what looks to us like very old school imperialism. And it's just very hard for us to understand when we've all spent so much time apologizing and reconciling and moving forward from that approach. But they're not there yet.
Well, let's turn to your frontline work, because not only do you go and support on the front with the terrible things that are going on there, you also help to sort of raise funds, because it's not cheap, obviously, a lot of the care that's being provided. And given the scale of the tragedy, I would imagine that resources are always scarce, and there is always the need for more and better quality resources, and of course, training and mentoring staff. So are these all areas you're involved with?
Correct. Started out a lot of, raising funds to help with just very simple but quality supplies, tourniquets, chest seals, life-saving things like that. And then the more evaluation that I was able to do in working with the Ukrainian medical professionals, recognizing that stuff that we have in every rural community in the UK and States and Canada, they lacked. And yet they're seeing ridiculous volumes of high acuity patients, and they don't have that equipment. And you can't just sort of, hey, here's a fancy ventilator, good luck. So we really, and the Ukrainian medical professionals are very much wanting, despite the fact that their system is a Soviet-based system. That's where their medical system has evolved out of, good and bad. But they really are trying to work towards knowing and understanding and implementing Western standards, Western evidence-based medicine, even though it's very different than what they've been used to. So when we're looking at not only bringing equipment, but bringing training for them, they want to have the best of the best for training, and they deserve it. So when we come, we're really working towards bringing certified courses. So the trauma program that we're trying to implement is based with the International Trauma Life Support organization. And they have a whole series of courses, including ones on high threat military type environments that are standardized, international, evidence-based, based on adult teaching models, just a real quality programs. And so we want to bring the equipment, we want to bring the training programs. And most of us in medicine are a little spoiled because we're used to now doing a lot of our training on very high quality mannequins, right? That are very lifelike. That's not the model they've been trained on, and it's something that they're lacking. So the goal of our current program is to implement a chapter, an ITLS chapter, which will empower them to take control and to develop, to become instructors of instructors, while still maintaining an international standard, because they won't get courses certified if they don't follow all of the criteria, just like the 160 other countries that are that have chapters have to do. And then providing them the resources to actually do the high level training and bringing in equipment to train them on, and then mentoring them. So it's not just, here you go, here's the training, here's the equipment, good luck, but saying, and now we're going to go with you. Because the reality is, despite having a immersion military type background, this has some very unique features that haven't really been encountered and aren't the sort of things that are classic NATO training, because it's just different. We don't have air superiority and helicopter evacuation, and evacuation chains are really long, and all of these sorts of things. So not only do we want to support them by being there with them and not just saying, hey, we came to Kyiv and we taught you, now go back to the East and good luck. But confirming that what we've taught them and how we've taught them is suitable for the environment that they're working in. Because, the walk a mile in someone's shoes really, takes on different significance in a war zone. And we have to be able to constantly support and understand and adjust what we provide, how we do what we provide to these people to make sure it meets the needs. And those needs are, unlikely to stay the same. It's going to be an evolution. So it's not like a one-off and you're on your own. You want to journey with them in this process.
Is there any analogy in your experience, or do you have to go back to, say, the Second World War, the First World War, to see the kinds of injuries at this scale that are being encountered?
Right. Well, I have a disaster background, so we kind of, you can see little hints of it with large earthquakes and trauma from that, but not, you really do have to go back to World War II to see anything close to the scale that's happening. I sort of say it's World War I and II, because there are chemical weapons in play as well, trench warfare, but with modern ammunition, modern things. I have to admit, from my own personal experience, the shelling you get used to, or at least I got used to it, and you don't like it, but you do. Drones, though, that's I don't know, I just feel like I'm in some weird Terminator movie, and that makes it different. That is not a doctrine that we have really had to explore before. So it has some unique factors, but you do really have to go back to World War II, World War I, and I guess Terminator movies or some other sci-fi movies to be able to try and understand what's happening. And certainly scale of wounds, nothing, even huge disasters are not really comparable to this.
And Ukraine, from my impression, and certainly challenge this if your experience on the ground is different, my impression is that Ukraine makes huge efforts to bring people back from the front lines as rapidly as possible, where they can sort of do some kind of stabilization on the front. But the imperative, or at least the sense, is that Ukrainians want to preserve the life of their people as far as possible, and the Russians do not. I mean, you won't have experienced, obviously, what's going on the Russian side, but do you think that they are likely to end up with fewer, let's say, amputees and so on? Because far, far fewer Russians are going to make it back from, whatever traumas they experience. I don't know if you've heard or seen anything.
Well, that's a tricky thing. I mean, and I obviously have not been on the Russian side, so I can't speak to how their system is set up, and the rumor mills. However, I have had a good friend of mine who works with me in frontline work, who spent a fair bit of time with a demining unit and came across, a lot of abandoned Russian bodies. I think, at least from my experience, the Ukrainians certainly make an effort to recover their dead. Would I go so far as to say that there will be less amputees because more of the Russians just died? I don't know. I mean, that takes into account a whole pile of other things. Maybe we're injuring more Russians, and so the percentage is the same, but volume is different. I don't know. I mean, you hear rumor that their health care, their emergency care is horrid, but I can't confirm that. I do know that one of my a friend, when they were moving forward to retake land, they did come across supplies, Russian medical supplies, and I can tell you that although the Ukrainian medical supplies, at least at that time, were ancient and inappropriate, these were worse. So that's my only somewhat direct experience with it, which is also heartbreaking. I mean, I do believe Russia is the aggressor, but I still have compassion and empathy for the mothers in Russia who are having their dead children returned to them. I don't care who you are. That's just, it's awful. War is just awful.
And the pointlessness, especially of this one.
Exactly.
You
Exactly.
know, people will find some justification, but I'm sure at some point in history, people will be telling them that this actually was pointless, and that sort of, you know, either the glory or the justifications they're using for themselves now to get through that that trauma. At some point, people turn around and say, "Well, you stupid, you believed all that," because this has happened before.
Yeah, yeah, it has, and again, heartbreak for them. Just what an awful, awful experience. But I think in some way you have to kind of, you know, you put yourself into their mindset, which is very near impossible because we just don't have the cultural similarity. But what do you have to do to convince yourself that this was a justified, you know, your son's death was justified or glorious, or I don't know.
Yeah, it's a mass
Yeah.
delusion of sorts, and we're
Yeah.
talking about that. Well, let's turn to
Yeah.
practical matters, because we are going to put links into the video to
Okay.
some of the charities you're involved in. Can you describe, I mean, we talked about resources being scarce. You talked about at the start of the war, the kind of supplies and kits available being relatively primitive. There are still a lot of issues, aren't there, in getting the right supplies to the right places in the right quantity. And there are other issues with quality. Have you come across quality issues with the kind of equipment you're supposed to be using?
So, you know, the Western world is super generous, kind, compassionate. You know, everybody when this started went down to their basement and picked up all their old first aid kits, and hospitals cleaned out rooms and stuff. And that's, you know, that's appreciated. But we're now at a stage of the war where what is needed is not always our secondhand stuff. Like, they really need quality, high caliber, you know, ventilators, monitors, stuff again we take for granted.
Even tourniquets, I think, was written about this
tourniquets,
week.
yeah. I mean, there's a whole pile of still knockoff tourniquets, Chinese tourniquets that are killing people. So it needs to be quality. And it needs to shift from this is what we have, so we're going to give it to you, to what do you need, and we'll get that for you. And that's we see this in disasters all the time, where people get really generous and you get inundated with clothes and all of this stuff that at some stage it's like, well, we don't need all of that. We need this. And sort of as a disaster analogy, that's where the war is now, where we need to go from a pushing things to them to a pull, what do you need? And then we'll mostly have to raise funds to get it because it's not sitting in the basement. And then provide that and, you know, combine it with all that training and stuff.
And that leads me to, I think, what is quite an interesting question. And you mentioned the Soviet state and the emerging state that's come out of its Soviet past, its processes, its systems. The impression I get is that Ukraine has an extraordinary civil society, in some ways more vibrant than many in the West, but that's because we assume that the state is going to deal with the various sort of problems. Ukrainians know that the state will not deal with most of the problems. So in your experience, how's that interaction between civil society and government work in your direct experience of trying to deliver frontline care?
So in historic or sort of NATO doctrine, to use that, and I'm not attempting to speak on NATO's behalf, but, you know, in our experience and training, anything that is along the front line like this would all be done by military units. That is not happening, which was a big shock to me. It's like, I'm sorry, you're doing what? But NGOs, non-governmental organizations and charities are stepping up. And to clarify, mostly Ukrainian-based, and some foreign-based as well, but not the big ones. The big ones are very risk-averse, which I understand, and they do not work in this environment. So now you have this sort of fractionated group of people who are trying to do their best, and are working in an environment that there really isn't a lot of historic experience in doing. There are, I mean, that's very positive because it shows a passion and a love, but there are risks with this. Number one, there really isn't an oversight. There isn't standards set. There's no SOP, standard operating procedure. So you're going to be a organization on the front doing medical care. Well, here is what we expect you to do. That doesn't exist. And the problem with that is that you have some groups that are very interested in making sure that they have high standards. And then you have others where that is not the case. And so you see a very big discrepancy in some of the care that's given. And to me, that's a bit heartbreaking, because when your leg's blown off, you don't get to choose who's taking care of you. I mean, not that we get to choose in the Western world either, but you really don't know what level of care you're going to get. And we're hoping with some of these initiatives to at least try and address that and say, okay, well, let's have something as a standard and ensure that at least this basic minimum standard is being done, because it really is, the Wild West of the East. And that's potentially quite dangerous. And there's also no oversight into, donations. And I'm not pointing fingers at any particular organizations, because I know most of them are, again, passionate. But the concept of accountability, the way we understand accountability in the West, is not inherent in some of the organizations. And that's potentially problematic too. And, I think as we continue to evolve, I think that's going to be demanded of these organizations. And that's good, and that, again, it can be used to help increase the level of care. And to me, like I said, I work with a number of organizations, and I mean, I'm not a charity, I'm a doctor, although I do this as charitable work. But we don't give tax receipts and stuff, because it's just me and my wonderful colleagues who are passionate about making sure that, irrespective of who's hurt, civilian, military, although I kind of laugh because these poor folks, a year and a half ago, were doing IT, and they said, the front's there, grab a gun and get some green stuff and away you go. So are they really military? I don't know. It's hard sometimes. And everyone, dresses in camo and has a weapon, so you can't tell who's who. At least I can. Anyone who's hurt or injured deserves quality care, no matter where or what or how. And that's what we want to see being done.
And of course, yes, this different organisations with a lack of overall standard, that must influence outcomes as well. I mean, there must be people who are, more traumatised than they need to be. There are those who may not survive because the quality of care is patchy.
Correct. Absolutely. And in my evaluation, I've seen that. And that's, like I said, that's one of the things that really weighs heavy on myself. And there's a handful of Western medical professionals. I mean, there's a ton of people volunteering, and kudos to them. But there's a very small group of doctors and nurses who, this is what we do. We do trauma training. This is what we do, and who are involved in this. And we see this over and over again. So we actually have a paper coming out in hopefully the end of this month or middle of this month, that is the first of hopefully a series that outlines some of the medical issues that have been raised and some potential suggestions to address them. One of the challenges that I actually hadn't thought about, and I don't have an answer to, but a colleague of mine brought up, two of my colleagues actually, because we're trying to arrange to meet. I leave for Ukraine tomorrow, trying to arrange to meet, and they're like, I can't afford to go. I'm leaving my home. I pay my own trip. I don't make a living when I'm there. And we've done this, collectively dozens of times, and the piggy bank has run out. And when we fundraise, we're not fundraising for our tickets, etc. Maybe we need to. I don't know if somebody has a bunch of air miles out there, travel points, maybe that would help. But it's becoming a bit of an issue amongst this peer group that I have, this professional peer group, because we really do need them on the ground. But our focus, like I said, from the financial perspective, we feel guilty if we're getting people to pay for our tickets, but we may get to a stage where we have to address that issue because we need to be there. But having to file bankruptcy isn't really conducive to doing that. So yeah, an unexpected problem that we've just started to encounter amongst our group working in this area.
That's a kind of stress I think that people don't need in what is already an incredibly stressful environment. Another challenge, which is quite a sensitive one, is potentially bureaucracy as well, isn't it? I mean, one of the reasons why Ukrainian civil society is so strong is they have the cultural impetus to do that, the unique character to be stubborn and to seek out problems and so on. But it also exists because the state is lacking and the state is incapable of solving certain problems and historically has been beset by slowness, corruption, dare I say it as well, and a host of other sort of problems that mean that the central government is not proactive. Have you also bumped up against issues in your encounters with administration?
Yes. Yeah, directly and indirectly, where we think easy solutions should happen, it becomes very bureaucratic, but this is the rule. It's like, but that doesn't make any sense. So change it. Like, you're in a war, you're on martial law, just go presto, away you go. And that's just not the process. And so it's very difficult. Even something simple like medical licensing, it currently doesn't exist in Ukraine for foreign doctors. So as a foreign physician, I'm going there and I'm providing care. But despite our best efforts, there is no licensing process, which actually is a bit of a risk for those of us who are doing this, because you go back and your home licensing body is like, well, you have to show us every place you've worked, you have to give us details. It's like, well, there's no details because there is no administrative process to recognize our licensing. Despite the fact, we may work and converse with the Ministry of Health and all of these folks, and we are real physicians and nurses, that bureaucracy just hasn't been addressed. And in the reverse, we do know of situations where people claim to be physicians, or I can't tell you the number of people who are special forces medics. And there are some genuine special forces medics, but people who are absolutely not. And they put themselves in situations where they're harming people. And that's terrifying. Again, if it was your brother, your uncle, your nephew, your child, that's not acceptable. So yeah, the bureaucracy is certainly there. I do want to just comment though on the corruption issue, because so corruption in, I guess, the formal definition, is I don't know, embezzling money or whatever, but it seems like it's a very concrete kind of thing. I think that there is a different layer of that maybe is linked to this bureaucracy or something, where you have ways of doing things that do not necessarily lend themselves to being upfront about how things are happening. And that is, there are foreign volunteers where this is impacted too. I mean, we all know of folks who, raised a ton of money back in their country and came over and are spending it all on pubs in Kyiv and Lviv. So that's, problematic as well. But I think this whole concept that even beyond the idea of corruption, you need to start promoting the concept of accountability and truth. Like, exactly, like, doesn't matter what you're doing, be upfront about what you're doing and be accountable for it. Show what you're doing. And I think if we sort of transition away, because corruption has so many layers and so many historic triggers to it, especially for these poor Ukrainian folks who are working their butts off to do something better, despite being stuck in a very old and bureaucratic system. If we maybe transition away from saying, oh, it's so corrupt, and say they're in transition to something that is transparent and accountable. And that, I think, would be very useful for NGOs that are in Ukraine, government that's in Ukraine, foreign NGOs that are in Ukraine. If accountability and transparency and truth can start to become the motto, or modus operandi, I think it will go a long ways to helping improve how things work.
And is there a difference in those treating civilians? Because we do see in the case of this war that not only are civilians collateral damage, but Russia is very specifically targeting civilian objectives. I mean, first of all, the question is going to be a humane one. What is your impression of that when you see the scale of civilian suffering? But then the second question is the infrastructure stretched to handle that as well?
Right. The infrastructure wasn't great to start with, at least from the healthcare perspective. And stretched is too kind of a word. I mean, it is imploded. I show pictures in some of my presentations of emergency departments. These are Soviet buildings, especially in the East. It's a little different in the West, but Soviet style buildings in a Soviet style system that does not have emergency departments, really. Like, their concept is very different for that part of care than what we're used to. And they're old and they're broken down, and the infrastructure wasn't great to provide this care to start with, and it is almost non-existent. I mean, to be honest, the civilian, the foreign NGOs, in conjunction with our Ukrainian colleagues, are literally propping it up with sticks, and the roof is caving in. And I have to say that the targeting, as I mentioned, I came in very neutral, and one of the first examples was actually a bombing that took place in Lviv. And it's very clearly, and I have it on a cell phone, very clearly, no military structure. There's a church, there's an apartment building, no infrastructure to target. Cruise missile kind of comes in, and it's like, well, maybe it was an accident, till the second one comes in, almost on top of it, like really good target. It's like, well, that's not accidental. And that's very clearly targeting a civilian population. Now, why? I don't know. I mean, terror does that, right? You strike fear in people and hope that they kowtow to that.
Well, that's the absolutely terrifying tactic that I was reading about, which is, I think, called the double tap. You hit a site, you give it a little bit of time, enough time for the ambulances to arrive, your colleagues, the professionals to arrive to sort of stabilize the victims, and then you hit the same spot again.
Right. My previous research when I was doing risk crisis disaster management was actually in the Troubles. You'd asked if I'd spent time in the war, and I haven't been to other wars, but my focus of research was Ireland during the Troubles. So that was, an undeclared kind of war. And they popularized, the double tap. The various organizations would have a little bomb go off. All the emergency responders would come, looky-loos would be like, oh, is everybody okay? Oh, look at the arm out there. And then the larger, detonation would happen. So it's kind of ironic to see something from, my past research and involvement being used, but on a much bigger scale, a terrifying scale.
It's horrific, isn't it? Absolutely horrific. Well, I know we're drawing to the end. My last question really is a practical one. I hope that people listening to this are sort of incredibly moved, as I am, by what you're saying. If people want to get involved but don't have medical training, what can they do to support? Because the need for, as you say, tourniquets and equipment of various types, as well as training, is acute. With the offensive that is now rolling out, it's only going to get greater and greater. What can people do to help?
Well, finances are, of course, the single most in need stuff. We do have, again, we are not a charity or stuff. We work with a bunch of NGOs, but myself and 4 of my colleagues sort of collaborate. And we have a website. It's Ukraine, no, medic team for the number Ukraine, which I'll email to you, Jonathan. So, and I haven't done these because I'm not technological, but someone else has done a website where e-transfers can happen, I guess, within North America, because I don't know how it works overseas. And there is a GoFundMe campaign as well that we're looking to raise funds for this work in general, although we've sort of targeted it for a very, for a mannequin. The mannequins are like $45,000. Like they're expensive, but the problem why we can't just go buy one, these are mannequins that are made specific to the needs that we outline. The type of wounding is not reflected in regular mannequins. So if you don't have one that reflects what you're going to see, you can't train them on it. So these ones are medium fidelity, really good mannequins, look very lifelike, and will change the training that we're able to do. And then we're also looking at one of our primary care, and actually maternity care, if we get enough money, which I never assume that we will, but because we do clinics from far away, and we have collaborators there, but they're not medical personnel. So can you imagine someone's coming and they're like, well, I'm short of breath, but you can't listen to their chest. And it's hard to practice medicine that way. So there are packaged kits that have, virtual stethoscopes and virtual scopes to look in eyes, ears, nose, and ultrasounds that we can teach them to use on our behalf. And sitting across the world, we can listen, and then we can provide the best care, that we can to these patients, and even to women who are now coming, who are, younger women who have returned to the East. Now they're building families, right, in a war zone. So that, and then a handheld lab machine, so that, if we're going to give medicine to a patient, we need to know what their blood is like, their potassium and stuff. It's just so dangerous for us to not have those tools. So those are the specifics. But if for some reason we raise a ton more, there's so much in this area that we'll do to continue to help. And I just want to thank, we've been so fortunate with kind words and donations, and people are donating whatever they can, but if everybody was able to donate $20 or $50, it adds up. And it makes a huge difference. And I know the people that we provide care to are greatly appreciative, as we are as well.
Well, the work you and your team are doing is tremendous. I very much hope that, despite the risks you're taking, that your team remains safe and you don't lose anyone on the front lines there. And I strongly encourage people to sort of support the work you're doing, because unfortunately, as we know, Russia is not going to give up and go home anytime soon. If anything, the scale of suffering is going to increase as Ukraine starts pressing Russia to push them out of their territories. So the need for everything you've described is only going to grow. But yeah, thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Thank you so much. And if people have other skills that I think they might want to offer, because again, we're medical people, not great tech and money raising and all that stuff, there's an email on the website as well, and they can contact us, and we're happy to try and have them contribute in that way as well. So again, thank you to your listeners for their support in all ways that it comes.